Deep in Akron, Ohio, a city formerly celebrated as the globe's rubber epicenter, sits a massive relic showcasing both the peak of American manufacturing and its certain downfall. The Goodyear manufacturing facility. Spanning more than 100 years, these brick and metal structures meant so much more than mere industrial buildings. They served as the lifeblood of the community, representing pure innovation, massive drive, and an unstoppable push toward the future. Launched in 1898 by Frank Seiberling, this bold concept quickly blossomed into a worldwide powerhouse. It supplied the very rubber that kept the nation's cars, big rigs, and aircraft moving across unimaginable distances. Akron's entire character was shaped by the constant hum of equipment, the steady pace of the production floor, and the exhausting shifts put in by thousands of dedicated workers. However, a much more somber reality exists just beneath that victorious surface. It is a story of being left behind and becoming outdated, highlighting the eerie void created once human drive inevitably collides with the unstoppable march of the years. Strolling by the stripped-down bones of these storage buildings right now, alongside the oxidizing steel of what used to be massive manufacturing floors, and through the quiet, vacant outdoor spaces where crews previously sweat and struggled, the heavy burden of the past is absolutely undeniable. Groundbreaking ideas used to flourish here, turning grand visions into reality as rubber spun down infinite assembly tracks. Yet today you will find nothing but ghosts. This complex serves simultaneously as a towering tribute to manufacturing greatness and a harsh reminder that nothing lasts forever. It perfectly captures the breathtaking heights of what people can build, while also proving that everything eventually falls apart. Looking down its dark, deserted hallways reveals much more than leftover machinery. It uncovers the lingering spirit of a bygone age. The local pulse that historically matched the spinning gears has finally stopped dropping a trail of legends that absolutely must be told. Chapter 1. The visionary behind it all, Franklin Augustus Seiberling, was far from just the guy who started a rubber business. He masterminded a manufacturing dynasty that permanently transformed a hometown, revolutionized a trade, and completely redefined how Americans traveled. Coming into the world on October 6, 1859, in Western Star, Ohio, Seiberling was raised surrounded by the sweeping fields and rapidly growing communities of the heartland. Way before the rumble of car motors echoed through neighborhoods, or the appearance of air-filled treads became a common, everyday thing across the country, he pictured a tomorrow driven by flexible materials and fresh ideas. When he was 38 years old, armed with little except sheer grit and sharp commercial intuition, he set out on an endeavor that totally overhauled Akron's DNA and laid the groundwork for a powerhouse that defined 20th century manufacturing. Following a corporate trip to Chicago back in 1898, Seiberling came home holding the deeds to two vacant properties right on Market Street. Instead of viewing them as derelict structures, he and his sibling Charles W. Seiberling spotted massive potential. Pumping their money into the site, they established the original headquarters for the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. They chose that specific title to pay tribute to Charles Goodyear, the 19th century scientist who stumbled upon vulcanization, a technique that finally gave raw rubber the toughness needed for heavy-duty applications. Starting off incredibly small, the duo kicked off their production lines by churning out common household and farm supplies like cushioning for horseshoes, wheels for buggies, and bike sealing gaskets for mason jars, and believe it or not, even gaming chips for poker tables. Their initial setup took over an old cardboard mill right along the Little Cuyahoga River in the eastern part of the city, an area destined to be world famous for making tires. Seiberling guided the crew with an absolute devotion to upgrading and pivoting whenever necessary. Those initial batches were nowhere near flawless, yet he recognized a gold mine while his peers just looked at plain sap. Steered by his vision, the brand quickly dove into testing treads tailored for the brand new car market, a sector that barely existed as the 1900s rolled in. Jumping ahead to 1901, they supplied treads for a race car, proving right away that they cared about speed and toughness. The thing that truly made him stand out against his wealthy contemporaries wasn't merely his knack for spotting a good deal, but his sheer guts when it came to stretching the limits of modern engineering. He got his own hands dirty working alongside the tech teams, threw cash at equipment to speed up the floor, and fiercely backed blueprints that eventually became the gold standard everywhere. Back in those opening days, you could count the entire payroll on a couple of hands. Yet once the car craze exploded during the early part of the 20th century, he had already leveled up that tiny crew into a massive powerhouse of mass production. None of his wealth happened by chance. It stemmed entirely from his razor-sharp read on the national economy. Picking Akron as his home base was a highly calculated move, not a lucky guess. The town was already packed with a dependable blue-collar crowd that really knew their way around a factory. It sat in a prime spot right by the Little Cuyahoga River for easy water access, linking up with major train routes that made moving raw supplies and completed products an absolute breeze. That powerful combo naturally turned Akron into the perfect center for rubber manufacturing, setting Goodyear up for explosive growth right out of the gate. By 1906, merely 8 years after getting the business off the ground, Seiberling's leadership had transformed Goodyear into an absolute powerhouse in the tire industry. They were churning out treads that perfectly matched the requirements of horse-drawn buggies and bikes, while also standing up to the heavy-duty punishment of cars, which were quickly taking the entire country by storm. Seiberling's relentless drive for cutting-edge design and top-tier quality cemented their name as a rock-solid partner for the earliest car makers. And the firm's own upward trajectory perfectly tracked right alongside the booming auto sector. However, there is a whole lot more to Frank Seiberling's legacy than just pulling in corporate profits. He cared passionately about the town that had welcomed his enterprise with open arms. Outside the plant gates, Seiberling's impact reached deep into city planning and community affairs. Seeing how fast-paced industrial booms put a massive squeeze on local housing and public works, he poured money into building homes for his workers and backed civic organizations focused on boosting the everyday lives of residents. His generous charitable work played a huge role in transforming Akron from a sleepy factory town into a thriving city fully prepared to handle its booming population. Even with all the incredible strides made under his watch, Seiberling's run as the top boss couldn't last forever. In 1921, following over 20 years of steering the very corporation he built from scratch, he and his sibling handed over the reins, pushed out by harsh financial struggles in the heavy economic slump following World War I. Even though he walked away, the rock-solid groundwork he established stood the test of time. Goodyear kept right on pushing boundaries, growing larger, and steering the tire market way past his departure. It stands as ultimate proof of Seiberling's permanent legacy. Looking at the big picture of American manufacturing history, Frank Seiberling truly shines as a guy whose foresight went way beyond the usual limits. Back when the entire country was making that lightning-fast jump from farming fields to factory floors, Seiberling capitalized on the massive potential of brand-new tech and untapped consumer bases. What he pulled off did a whole lot more than just launch a business. It sparked massive financial booms, totally reshaped a hometown, and pretty much wrote the rulebook for a whole trade. Whenever we reflect on the Goodyear's journey and how car culture blew up stateside, we don't just notice the gears and plants, but the lasting mark of a visionary whose drive literally kept the wheels of innovation turning. Chapter 2. The Dawn of the Akron Plant. Getting that Akron facility off the ground was definitely no happy accident. It all came down to calculated moves driven by the right chances, the perfect spot, and killer timing. It was a perfect storm that eventually put Akron, Ohio dead center in the country's infant tire business, morphing an ordinary Midwestern spot into the undisputed rubber capital of the globe. Back when Frank and Charles Seiberling first opened the doors to the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in 1898, they kicked things off inside a pair of rundown, empty plants on Market Street over in Akron, Ohio, a blue-collar town home to roughly 50,000 folks. Back then, the Seiberling brothers were taking a massive gamble on an industry where rubber was just starting to flex its muscles, all thanks to Charles Goodyear cooking up the vulcanization method years prior, a trick that turned rubber tough, stretchy, and totally perfect for heavy-duty commercial goods. Even though their earliest goods were just basic horseshoe cushions, rubber poker chips alongside buggy and bike wheels, setting up shop in Akron turned out to be an incredibly smart move. Akron was absolutely not picked out of a hat. Way before Goodyear ever showed up, that neck of the woods was already deep into the rubber game, thanks to heavy hitters like B.F. Goodrich setting down roots there during the 1870s. Having those guys around early on built up a solid pool of seasoned factory workers, an absolute lifesaver for businesses like Goodyear that desperately needed hands for the tough gig of churning out rubber. On top of all that, Akron's spot on the map gave it a massive edge for shipping. The town was perched right near the Little Cuyahoga River for all its water needs. Plus, it tied into the B&O train tracks, making it super simple to move raw stuff in and finished goods out. Having those solid supply lines was a total make-or-break factor back in an age when rail and river routes basically decided if a factory lived or died. Natural rubber obviously didn't grow on trees in Ohio. It had to be shipped all the way from tropical hotspots down in South America and over in Southeast Asia. Even so, Akron's killer transit links and pre-built factory setups meant they could pull in raw supplies without a hitch and pump out finished tires to buyers across the Midwest and way out past state lines. The massive web of train tracks gave Goodyear the perfect fast lane to get their stuff straight to car makers and storefronts. And being just a stone's throw away from booming auto capitals like Detroit just made the town look even better for business. Those early days at the plant were a wild mix of incredibly humble roots and ridiculously fast-paced growth. When the Seiberlings first launched their business, they operated with just a handful of employees making simple goods. However, the birth of the motor vehicle era triggered a massive spike in the need for dependable rubber wheels. Seeing that automobiles were destined to overtake horse-drawn buggies and bikes as the main way people got around, Goodyear swiftly pivoted to manufacturing auto tires. In a matter of only a few years, that unassuming Market Street facility exploded in sheer scale and overarching vision. Heading into the early 1900s, the company was churning out groundbreaking wheel layouts, which made putting them on and taking them off a breeze, giving average motorists a highly convenient solution. Furthermore, the sprawling manufacturing plant began to deeply shape the surrounding community. What used to be the sleepy industrial village of Akron absolutely exploded with laborers flocking there for guaranteed paychecks. Over the course of 10 short years, the number of residents in Akron skyrocketed, driven entirely by manufacturing plants bringing in massive waves of foreign newcomers and domestic transplants eager for work. The massive success at Goodyear essentially acted as a magnet, pulling competing polymer enterprises right into the neighborhood, forming a concentrated manufacturing hub that cemented the commercial reputation of Akron and propelled the municipality to the absolute top of the country's tire industry. During the 1910s, a huge chunk of global rubber goods came straight out of Akron, with Goodyear leading the charge in this massive industrial shift. The plant completely transformed from a few tiny structures into a massive sprawling network of production floors, blending chambers, research laboratories, and corporate headquarters. Covering tens of acres of real estate by the 1910s, the corporation stood as a premier job creator in the Midwest. Crafting these wheels required a tremendous amount of heavy physical labor. Unprocessed latex needed to be blended with synthetic compounds formed into specific contours pressed and heat-treated inside scorching hot machines, demanding a huge crew of both trained craftsmen and general laborers. Because the endeavor was so colossal, the company had to hire thousands of extra hands, and their hard work turned Akron into a thriving commercial powerhouse, where the constant scent of vulcanization and the roar of engines became the local heartbeat. Naturally, the surrounding civic framework evolved right alongside the plant's massive output. Housing developments stretched further out, mom-and-pop shops thrived by catering to the massive employee base, and public services stepped up to support an exploding population. The Seiberling household actually played a direct role in driving these massive community upgrades. Frank Seiberling personally funded residential tracts for his staff, and his vision for city organization permanently left a mark on the layout of Akron. A bare-bones wheel shop had literally transformed into the financial beating heart of the municipality. Furthermore, the opening of this Akron facility ignited the company's meteoric rise to the top, while simultaneously kicking off a cultural and financial awakening that would dictate the future of Akron for decades on end. Chapter 3. Growth and Breakthroughs. As the primary Goodyear facility located in Akron, Ohio transitioned into the early decades of the 20th century. The organization went through an unmatched era of evolution, firmly locking in its status as a fundamental pillar of United States manufacturing. That once tiny workshop positioned on Market Street had blossomed into an enormous production maze, buzzing constantly with heavy equipment, tireless workers, and cutting-edge ideas, covering massive swaths of property and constantly beating to the tune of sweat, equity, and roaring engines. The sheer popularity of the car generated a need for wheels that totally eclipsed the company's initial output capacities. Frank Seiberling quickly realized that keeping up with orders meant doing a whole lot more than just speeding up the assembly line. It was going to take relentless engineering upgrades and massive scaling across the board. Production bays popped up everywhere. Builders threw up brand new blending spaces to process massive shipments of unprocessed latex, while the main manufacturing wings were expanded in every direction to house state-of-the-art stamping and shaping equipment. Dedicated science wings were built right into the plant, giving technical experts and scientists the space to play around with fresh material recipes, synthetic chemicals, and next-generation heat-treating methods, guaranteeing that any wheel rolling out of Akron was tough enough to handle the faster paces and heavier weights of cars hauling rigs and eventually early aircraft. These upgrades were far from minor stepping stones. They completely flipped the script on how modern wheels were dreamed up and put together. It ranged from rolling out detachable rims that made upkeep a total breeze to perfectly dialing in chemical blends that offered both bounce and bulletproof strength. The personnel side of this massive scale-up was equally mind-blowing. Staffing numbers shot up from a few pioneer workers to many thousands of active personnel, pulling in experienced tradesmen from the local area, along with hopeful foreigners chasing the ultimate blue-collar dream in the United States. Crews pushed through brutally exhausting and sometimes incredibly dangerous environments, tackling endless shifts, the sweltering temperatures of the baking rooms, and the daily threat of getting hurt. Still, their relentless grit and know-how were the absolute backbone of the plant's explosive success. These men and women were definitely not just standing on the sidelines. The insights and reactions from these workers played a huge role in tweaking how things were made and making the actual tire blueprints much better, turning the workplace into an energetic space where coming up with fresh ideas relied just as heavily on people as it did on machines. Every single division was thoroughly synced up, starting at the science labs, checking out fresh chemical blends, moving down to the processing levels, where unprocessed rubber met various compounds all the way to the production belts that molded, treated, and completed the final product. Each phase of the building process leaned heavily on the others, creating an intricate, well-oiled machine where exactness and speed meant everything, and any slip-up would result in massive losses of both precious hours and valuable supplies. Seiberling had his eyes on a much bigger picture that went way past the day-to-day running of the plant. He realized right away that being set up in Akron brought some serious geographical perks to the table. Being super close to the train lines meant they could quickly move both their base supplies and their completed goods. Nearby waterways offered the crucial elements needed for heavy manufacturing, while a built-in community of blue-collar workers allowed the company to expand fast without wasting months getting a green crew up to speed. When you paired these practical location benefits with Seiberling's dedication to pushing boundaries, it set Goodyear up perfectly to completely take over the tire market, both here at home and all across the globe. Around the middle of the 1910s, the plant shifted gears from just pumping out rubber for bikes and horse-drawn buggies to outfitting cars and heavy-duty transport vehicles, perfectly matching the demands of a world going through massive shifts in technology and everyday life. The company even started crafting gear for the first flying machines, stepping up when the brand-new aviation sector started begging for tough featherlight and incredibly reliable components. The entire facility practically transformed into a giant testing ground, with smart minds constantly trying out untested material blends, tweaking the way things were shaped in the presses, and figuring out how to crank out products much faster without letting the actual craftsmanship slip one bit. This never-ending push to get better really showcased their core belief: you cannot separate human creativity from mechanical exactness, and moving forward absolutely requires both the sweat of the floor staff and the smart planning of the bosses. The actual footprint of the facility grew right alongside their massive mechanical goals. They threw up entirely new structures dedicated to distinct parts of the workflow, spanning everything from holding unprocessed goods and mixing chemicals to the pressing, treating, and ultimate quality checks. The front office staff kept a close eye on how all these different branches worked together, making certain that the daily grind stayed smooth and that they were hitting their quota numbers right on schedule. Unprocessed sap brought in from warmer climates underwent incredibly careful handling, while the ready-to-use treads were sent all over the country and more straight out to foreign buyers, firmly putting Akron on the map as the absolute center of the worldwide rubber trade. However, right next to all these incredible wins was the heavy toll this booming mass production took on the people actually doing it. Employees pushed through incredibly grueling hours, breathed in harsh industrial mixtures, and dealt with the never-ending roar of massive equipment, serving as a harsh reminder to every single person on the floor that moving into the future demanded real sacrifice. Because of all of this, you really couldn't separate the growth and upgrades at Goodyear from the town it called home. When the facility got bigger, Akron blew up right along with it. Local housing, mom-and-pop shops, and public services had to level up fast to keep pace with an employee base that had ballooned into the thousands, effectively turning the town into a wildly active manufacturing powerhouse, thanks entirely to the company's massive wins. The massive shadow of the plant ended up touching basically every single corner of everyday living in the area, dictating everything from the pacing of the workday to the way the local society and economy actually functioned. Once this massive boom period wrapped up, the facility was way more than just a place that made things. It stood tall as a massive monument to the sheer manufacturing muscle of the United States, acting as a hub where hard human effort and brilliant machinery combined to build the very things that physically move the country into the future. Each and every piece of rubber that came down the conveyor belt stood for way more than just engineering know-how. It was the physical proof of a creator who completely grasped how drive-lucky brakes and pure elbow grease all work together. This specific window of explosive growth and fresh ideas permanently cemented Akron's reputation as the undisputed king of rubber, while also locking in Goodyear's long-lasting status as the top dog in global production. What we see in this specific era is a massive tale of moving forward and thinking outside the box, proving just how unstoppable the urge to create new things really is. Showing the drive to grow and turn completely regular materials into something amazing, even while shining a light on the intense stress, constant hurdles, and heavy personal costs that made all these incredible wins possible, ultimately leaving a permanent mark on the town, the business, and the plant for decades down the line. Chapter 4. Akron, the undisputed king of rubber. Right around the first 20 years of the 20th century, this Ohio town stepped right out of the shadows to claim the absolute top spot in the nation's wheel business. It was a place where you simply couldn't untangle the town's spirit from the massive plants, the gritty workforce, and the products they were pumping out daily. With giants like Goodyear exploding onto the scene, Akron morphed from a quiet middle-of-nowhere Midwestern spot into an incredibly loud and busy manufacturing giant, naturally grabbing the famous title as the worldwide heavy hitter of the rubber game. Financial growth only tells part of the story when looking at this massive shift. The entire local way of life, the makeup of the population, and the physical layout of the town went through a complete overhaul. Streets that used to be dead silent suddenly filled up with worker row houses, cheap rental rooms, and mom-and-pop storefronts built specifically to serve the massive crowds showing up for a steady paycheck. A heavy, unmistakable mix of synthetic compounds and raw materials constantly hung in the breeze, while the endless roar of heavy equipment and the steady beat of grinding work became the absolute soundtrack of everyday living. Having massive heavyweight players like Goodyear, B.F. Goodrich, and Firestone sharing the same backyard sparked a fiercely cutthroat business climate. That intense rivalry drove constant upgrades, massive physical growth, and a never-ending push to shave seconds off the clock. Production plants exploded in both massive scale and complicated layouts featuring specialized workspaces, material blending areas, moving production tracks, and high-tech testing labs that literally swallowed up entire stretches of Akron's local communities, completely morphing average residential streets into bustling hubs of manufacturing, scientific discovery, and serious cash flow. The town's entire soul got so wrapped up in the rubber business that the incredible highs, the brutal lows, and the cutting-edge breakthroughs of these massive plants rippled through absolutely everything. It dictated who got hired, how the local roads were built, and even heavily influenced the daily schedules of neighborhood schools and churches. None of this massive growth would have happened without the hardworking people sweating on the floor. Absolute floods of men and women flocked to Akron from neighboring communities, the quiet Ohio countryside, and overseas backgrounds, all chasing the reliable cash that the exploding rubber market virtually guaranteed. Management expected grueling, back-breaking shifts, frequently in environments that were pretty risky. Still, for countless folks, clocking in every morning meant a real shot at a secure future in a fast modernizing nation. These massive complexes did more than just invent better machines. They actually pioneered entirely new ways of organizing human effort. Bosses rolled out some of the very first true efficiency systems and standards checks, while the guys on the floor offered hands-on advice that totally revamped how things were built. This constant back-and-forth forged a highly cooperative manufacturing scene where brilliant human ideas and exact machine performance teamed up flawlessly to power the town's explosive ascent. Educational facilities, places of worship, and neighborhood shops had to scale up massively just to handle the massive wave of newcomers. And at the same time, new residential tracts popped up right next to the massive plants. This proved exactly how deeply the community relied on the rubber giants funding the local boom. With Akron's headcount skyrocketing, the municipal framework had to seriously adapt. This meant laying down fresh streets, brand new train lines, and major power grids designed to serve both the massive corporations and the everyday citizens, which ultimately tied the manufacturing giants and the urban center even closer together. Akron's total control over the rubber market extended way past its own backyard. The town morphed into an absolute magnet for fresh ideas, pulling in factory owners, brilliant designers, and deep-pocketed backers from coast to coast and all over the globe. Leading the charge from their local home bases, Goodyear and competing firms engineered tough new treads that could handle blistering highway paces, massive cargo weights, and brutal environments. Ultimately, they ended up outfitting everything from everyday family cars and heavy haulers to, eventually, aircraft. Local development labs pushed the absolute limits of chemical compounds and production strategies, sharing critical discoveries and techniques that revolutionized entire industries far outside the actual plant walls. Before long, Akron simply became the go-to word for dependability, cutting-edge tech, and massive manufacturing dreams, linking the area's reputation completely to the very treads that kept the nation's cars moving down endless stretches of highway. Even so, Akron's reign as the undisputed king of rubber was not just one big perfect victory lap. Hiding right behind those massive brick walls was the brutal truth of backbreaking manual work, the endless stress of staying ahead of the curve, and the severe toll that nonstop growth took on everyday folks. The production lines were boiling, deafeningly loud and incredibly risky, where crazy long shifts and breathing in toxic fumes wore down both bodies and minds. Even with all those serious hurdles, the community and its labor force figured out how to survive and thrive, building a fiercely tough and clever mindset that kept Akron at the absolute top of the rubber game for generations. Because the town and the plants relied on each other so heavily whenever the companies hit a hot streak or took a sudden dive, the locals and their surrounding communities felt those exact same financial shockwaves. Explosive production spikes delivered serious cash-fresh chances and a deep sense of hometown glory. At the same time, it left the area incredibly exposed. Everyone knew that any sudden changes in modern tech, fierce rival companies, or market crashes could completely upend their entire way of life. By the time the 1920s and 1930s rolled around, Akron had absolutely locked down its title as the undisputed global center of rubber making. Massive manufacturing plants ruled the horizon, signing the paychecks for tens of thousands of locals and supercharging the financial landscape on a scale practically unseen in any other factory town. Sitting at the top as the biggest and most powerful player, Goodyear essentially became the face of Akron. Its sprawling complexes covered massive chunks of the map, serving as undeniable concrete proof of big dreams, relentless progress, and absolute manufacturing dominance. The town completely morphed into the worldwide hub of the rubber industry. It became a crossroads where backbreaking work engineering, brilliance, and business foresight collided, molding both the goods they manufactured and the actual culture and layout of the town itself. The massive plants left their undeniable mark across every avenue, housing block, and town square. Everyday existence marched straight to the beat of the assembly belts and the constant influx of supplies, and the endless outbound freight of completed goods heading out stateside and overseas. Akron's massive grip on the rubber market turned into a classic chapter of the United States industrial boom, representing how factory towns exploded in growth. The complex dance between fresh ideas and elbow grease, alongside the massive impact of forward-thinking founders. Drive smarts and pure sweat built the place, though it always remained haunted by the dark downsides of the manufacturing boom. The crushing push for more output, the daily dangers hanging over the crew, and the hard truth that even the biggest corporate giants eventually fade away. Akron, wearing the crown as the global rubber kingpin, showcases our sheer genius alongside the shaky nature of factory dominance, creating a history that feels both amazing and like a massive cautionary tale. It stands as absolute proof of how high sheer drive and modern tech can take us, alongside a stark warning that the exact same things that build a town up can eventually drag it back down just as surely and deeply. Chapter 5. Inside the plant walls. The Goodyear facility operated completely as its own isolated universe, a tiny model of corporate drive where everyday sweat and exact machinery mixed into something incredibly amazing, yet entirely brutal. The shop floor constantly buzzed nonstop with the deafening noise of heavy equipment. Massive presses and superheated ovens created a mesmerizing looping noise of endless work and forward momentum. Employees navigated the chaotic space on a strict mission, with absolutely every move perfectly synced to the assembly belt. But right under that smooth exterior sat a deeply personal tale of dead tired people, constant danger, and doing the exact same thing over and over. Guys and gals, mostly pulling from Akron and the surrounding local areas, worked brutal shifts at boiling machines, hauling massive chunks of raw material, and running dangerous tools that could easily snap an arm or crush a hand without warning. The room had always felt heavy with sweltering warmth, harsh fumes, and the dead giveaway smell of sticky materials cooking down. This intense physical vibe constantly hammered home the reality that the staff were acting as both essential cogs and active players in this massive machine. The second someone punched the clock, the facility absolutely required perfect focus. One tiny slip-up could completely stop the line wreck expensive gear or put someone in the hospital. But the heavy grind just went on endlessly, without pausing, since everyone outside desperately needed the wheels they were cranking out right there. The daily jobs at Goodyear were mapped out flawlessly, showcasing exactly what the top brass wanted alongside the strict requirements of mass manufacturing. Specific sections were totally split up by whatever exact job they handled. Blending areas handled tossing raw goods together with sulfur carbon black powder and extra compounds. Meanwhile, massive shaping areas forced flat sheets right into exact molds. Superheated ovens baked the soft stuff into tough wheels, while checkpoint zones closely looked over the final goods to catch any flaws. Every single person acted as a vital link in the whole system. Even with all the heavy focus on numbers and speed, actual living, people still held the whole thing together. Veterans took the rookies under their wing, showing them all the little tricks regarding timing, touch, and skill that totally went beyond what a machine could ever pull off. Fresh faces figured it all out simply by watching closely, doing things over and over, and taking pointers. They soaked up the necessary know-how, sure, but they also quickly caught on to the silent, tough attitude required to simply survive a shift. The building essentially acted as both a rough classroom and a total war zone. It highly rewarded pure grit and talent, but any mess-ups quickly turned into expensive and lethal disasters. The grueling nature of the job totally pushed past just muscle work, demanding that everyone stay incredibly sharp in their heads at all times. Pumping out those wheels was never something you could just casually hit pause on or joke around with. The slightest little mistake with the heat, the compound recipe, or the clock easily trashed an entire run of goods. Foremen constantly paced the aisles nonstop, keeping a strict eye on both speed and the final product. Seeing them looming around definitely reminded everyone who called the shots and why they had to stay sharp. The crew absolutely swallowed that stress daily, building up an insane mix of lightning speed, pinpoint focus, and raw stamina that let the facility run at a massive scale no one could have even pictured just a little while back. Even with the brutal environment throwing them around, everyone on the floor felt a deep bond. They knew every single finished wheel meant keeping the business afloat, putting food on their own tables, expanding their hometown, and actually fueling the massive travel boom, completely taking over the country. Factory life didn't just stay on the floor. The community structures that sprouted up around the plant deeply influenced everyone's day-to-day existence. Strict clock-ins ruled everything, meaning a person's off-the-clock hours marched entirely to the company's beat. Workers grabbed their grub in specific spots during short, no-nonsense lunch periods, with every rest interval engineered strictly to keep output high. Beyond the plant gates, whole residential blocks sprouted to give the workforce a place to live, forging close communities united by the same grueling work and common struggles. Everything from local congregations to classrooms and corner stores shifted their operating times to match the grueling whistle-to-whistle demands of the plant, locking the town's heartbeat even tighter into the steady pulse of mass manufacturing. Still, despite that strong local bond, working at the plant came with heavy restrictions on how you could live. Grueling hours wiped out any chance for downtime, leaving folks chronically drained while navigating the everyday threats of sickness, bodily harm, and deep weariness. People praise these crews for their tough grit and talent, yet the true cost of moving society forward was paid in intense physical labor, sweat, and sometimes lifelong bodily damage. Having to run increasingly advanced machinery just cranked up the everyday stress on the folks working the line. Turning raw materials into molded rubber wasn't just about raw muscle. You really had to know the science behind what you were doing. It was absolutely critical to grasp exactly how shifts in heat, moisture in the air, and split-second timing could alter the finished good. The crew got to know their equipment inside and out, picking up on tiny changes in the hum of the gears or the shake of a belt, along with the feel of the material to tell if things were running smoothly or about to break down entirely. Rookies shadowed the old-timers, soaking in years of hard-earned know-how, required to keep standards high in a job that blended chemical reactions, mechanical forces, and pure manual talent. Even with the constant risks, taking pride in their handiwork and knowing they were pushing the nation's industry forward gave people a real sense of mission, making them feel their daily grind was making history. Day-to-day existence within the Goodyear facility was definitely a study in extremes. On one hand, the building stood as a beacon of forward momentum, fresh ideas and good pay, while on the other, it bred constant stress, workplace hazards, and sheer exhaustion. The daily grind paid the bills and offered its own kind of satisfaction, but it never stopped, never compromised, and rarely showed mercy. It was an environment where sheer personal drive crashed into massive mechanical power, churning out incredible success right alongside genuine suffering. As Akron exploded in size right in step with these massive plants and the town essentially became the global capital of rubber, the everyday trials of these floor workers perfectly captured the wider story of American manufacturing. It was a mix of deep drive, open doors, tough sacrifices, and the hidden price tag of modernization. Each wheel that rolled off the line held more than just practical value. It bore the invisible stamp of serious physical grit, talent, and stamina. Inside that sprawling Goodyear complex, cutting-edge tech and raw elbow grease tangled together in a highly intricate, demanding, and back-breaking routine, charting the course for the whole sector while defining the existence of the workforce. As that time period closed, the facility stood as far more than just a spot to make goods. It was an absolute testing ground for personal toughness, mechanical brilliance, and corporate hunger. The place perfectly captured both the incredible upside and the dark dangers of early 20th century mass production, acting as an arena where moving forward meant giving something up, and every single win was permanently tied to the brutal sweat that built it. Putting in hours at the Goodyear plant was ultimately an amazing yet punishing experience. It stood as a tribute to the sheer stamina of the crew, the forward-thinking plans of the higher-ups, and the unstoppable push to forge a rubber and steel dynasty that would forever change Akron, the entire country, in the global manufacturing scene. Chapter 6. The first cracks in the foundation. By the middle of the 20th century, the massive Goodyear facility in Akron, Ohio, was sitting right at the absolute peak of its power, a massive, sprawling operation that totally dictated the local cash flow and gave the locals their entire sense of self. Still right when output was hitting all-time highs, quiet shifts started bubbling up, hinting at serious upcoming struggles that were going to push the plant to its limits, challenge the people running the machines, and shake the entire manufacturing bedrock of Akron. Those initial red flags of a downturn weren't flashy or loud. They crept in under the radar, showing up as slightly erratic work hours, heavy machinery that seemed to break down even with nonstop upkeep, and fresh rivals wielding clever ideas and cheaper operations that threatened to chip away at Goodyear's supposedly bulletproof monopoly. The push toward a global market, rapidly advancing tech, and the heavy push toward automated assembly lines whipped up a storm that the old-school bosses and union crews just weren't ready to handle. The very same facility that used to be the gold standard for massive growth and flawless output was suddenly waking up to the hard truth that you couldn't expand forever, and they'd have to pivot hard just to survive in an industry that was mutating by the minute. The years following the war delivered a massive economic boom, but they brought a mountain of new stress right along with it. Even though Americans were still buying plenty of tires during the massive car booms of the 1950s and 1960s, the rules of the game were starting to change. Overseas competitors began flooding American shores with much cheaper options, forcing the company to completely rethink how much they charged, the way they built things, and their deals with the workers. Meanwhile, massive shifts in how tires were engineered, alongside leaps in robotics and raw materials, meant they had to pour huge amounts of money into fresh equipment and worker education. Areas of the facility that used to be incredibly cutting edge were clearly getting outdated. Manufacturing tracks built for older eras just couldn't handle the newer creations like radial and performance models, along with the custom goods buyers were suddenly asking for. Whole wings of the facility started running incredibly poorly. Major slowdowns popped up, leaving the bosses with tough calls on what to upgrade and what to scrap entirely. Employees who were used to clocking in for reliable clockwork-like shifts started getting nervous about the future. Veterans of the floor watched their usual stations sit empty for stretches, while flashy gear went up in other spots, replacing their deep satisfaction and constant output with real worry about where the company was heading. The dynamic between the bosses and the crew definitely mirrored this rising stress. For a long time, the corporation had offered totally reliable paychecks, allowing organized labor to plant deep roots among the staff. But as the way things were made began to transform, fights regarding pay scheduling and shop floor safety sparked up constantly. Plenty of folks pushed back against the incoming tech, terrified they would get fired or lose their specialized value. All while the higher-ups tried desperately to juggle upgrading the facility with keeping everyone happy and working hard. The initial red flags of a downturn were just as much about people as they were about machinery, highlighting the growing friction between manpower and automation. That massive shop floor, formerly a hub of perfect teamwork and honor, now held spots of serious anxiety areas doing barely any work. Conveyor belts that sat dead for hours on end, and staff members wondering if the place could keep providing the solid living it always had. On top of that, financial waves hitting way beyond city limits were making things even harder. The entire American tire business found itself constantly hammered by cheap imports from abroad, wildly shifting raw material costs and totally different driving habits from regular people. Federal rules, international pacts, and evolving highway systems threw entirely new curveballs that the local executives simply couldn't manage. Pumping money into the business used to guarantee you stayed on top, but now it took intense math because upgrading was a gamble, and the threat of expanding too fast was very real across the massive site. Certain structures started to sit half empty. Storage hubs got stuffed with leftover supplies, while older wings got turned into something else, or shut down completely. Just looking out over the sprawling complex, what used to be a shining monument to progress and growth now looked like a giant beast being forced to evolve. Even with those warning lights flashing, the grit of the people working there never really broke. The crews kept pumping out top-tier rubber, coming up with clever fixes and learning the new systems. While the massive big-picture problems were obvious to everyone, different teams kept trying little tweaks to make things better. Mechanics worked hard to update the ancient gear, and the leadership tried to weigh spending against saving. The place stayed open, but the unstoppable boom times of the past were officially over. The town itself started catching the quiet ripples as this famous booming manufacturing hub gave off its earliest signs of real struggle. Communities that used to live large off-plant paychecks suddenly faced dragging stretches of tight money. Mom-and-pop shops had to brace for fewer dollars walking through the door, and that untouchable vibe surrounding both the corporation and the town started to crack. The slide down didn't happen in one massive disaster. Instead, it was a slow pileup of heavy burdens from both inside and outside the gates, proving that the facility's reign wasn't a sure thing anymore. You could see it in the empty rooms, rusty tools, shaky union dynamics, and the relentlessly growing nightmare of battling in a modern worldwide economy. For the folks punching the clock there, this era was incredibly shaky, demanding folks be flexible, tough as nails, and willing to admit that the massive powerhouse they built from the ground up was morphing into something completely different. The old story of endless growth and fresh ideas got replaced by a mindset of playing it safe. It turned into a chapter where survival meant perfectly mixing old traditions with high-tech updates, hard-earned respect with practical reality, and sheer manpower with the unstoppable tidal wave of new tech. When this chapter finally closed, that enormous Goodyear manufacturing facility represented a massive triumph in American production, while simultaneously serving as a stark warning about how easily corporate giants can crumble. Those initial hints of a downturn rarely screamed for attention, but they never went away, kicking off a sluggish, unavoidable shift from maximum output into the messy truth of trying to upgrade, adapt, and ultimately shrink. Lurking in the dark corners of those previously booming production floors, a narrative blending blue-collar grit engineering dreams and shifting financial tides played out not through some sudden crash, but by way of a silent, unstoppable slide that ultimately sealed the destiny of the factory, Akron itself, and the futures of countless workers who poured their souls into building the very wheels that literally kept America moving. Chapter 7. The Closing Era. As the late 20th century rolled around, that massive Goodyear facility located in Akron, Ohio, long hailed as the ultimate beacon of stateside manufacturing power and forward-thinking ingenuity, stumbled into an era defined by downsizing, widespread doubt, and an unavoidable end. That massive, wide-ranging property, acting for decades as the beating heart for endless shifts, soaring goals, and sheer physical effort, was finally showing clear-cut evidence that its glory days were officially in the rearview mirror. Previously packed conveyor belts either crawled along at half speed or shut down completely, leaving entire wings of the building totally dead, while fresh manufacturing methods robotic integration, and overseas rivals totally flipped the rubber business. A powerhouse that previously handed out paychecks to legions of locals fueled an entire town and fed America's booming car obsession was rapidly scaling back. Because of this, Akron's proud title as the undisputed rubber capital of the globe faced an unprecedented threat. A site that used to stand as the ultimate tribute to corporate advancement transformed into a bizarre mix of extremes. People working right next to completely dead equipment, cutting-edge tech sitting beside outdated junk, and dreams of pivoting, fighting against the heavy cloud of failure. You could practically feel the heavy toll this shift took on the actual workforce. Entire families who spent their whole lives clocking in had to swallow the terrifying truth that their back-breaking sweat, specialized skills, and deep loyalty simply wouldn't be enough to keep their paychecks safe anymore. The executive suite was simultaneously drowning in a messy web of headaches, changing international markets, skyrocketing payroll expenses, and cheap overseas factories relentlessly chipped away at Goodyear's long-standing dominance, pushing the top brass to make brutal calls regarding which specific floors to upgrade, what regional buildings to merge together, and which parts of the business to just completely scrap. Every single move sent shockwaves right down to the floor, workers wrecking daily habits, uprooting whole households and straining deep neighborhood bonds. Entire wings of the property that used to represent the absolute cutting edge of manufacturing got locked up tight, stripping out the essential tools or just letting them rot, turning structures that used to buzz with life into quiet memorials of the good old days. For a lot of the core crew, those last few years were just a constant blur of anxiety. Union deals got ripped up and redone buyouts were aggressively dangled in front of older folks, and the idea of retiring from the company seemed like a total pipe dream. That legendary swagger of being a factory hand got buried under pure stress while the crew watched the very foundations of their livelihoods slowly crumble away piece by piece. You literally couldn't turn a blind eye to how the actual property was physically falling apart. Massive storage spaces that used to be packed to the ceiling with fresh materials and ready-to-ship inventory were suddenly looking incredibly hollow. Giant work floors that used to violently shake from the heavy machinery went totally dead, turning vast stretches of the property into creepy, rotting ghost towns. Buildings that were literally designed to showcase sheer corporate dominance and progress were now just showing off how badly they'd been ignored and left to rust. Corroded gears, flaking walls, busted concrete, and ditched tools just sat there quietly proving that the glory days were long gone. The mind-blowing size of the place, which used to make people swell with hometown pride, just made the heartbreak worse, turning gigantic rooms that used to pulse with thousands of busy hands into massive hollow echo chambers. Later on, aerial shots and pictures from that specific era would expose a campus totally stuck in a weird limbo, serving as a literal time capsule of America's manufacturing peak and its brutal, unstoppable downfall. Those closing days also highlighted just how hard these corporate shifts hit the actual blue-collar folks. Lifers who had been there forever dealt with the heavy mental drain of seeing their second home, a place that was basically their entire personality and completely full of life, just waste away right in front of them. Taking rookies under their wing, grabbing beers after a shift, and that unspoken factory flow got completely wrecked, forcing the remaining crew to walk into a building they knew perfectly but felt entirely alien. Neighborhoods built entirely around the factory's paychecks felt the financial shockwaves big time, since fewer jobs and dead production lines immediately started killing off nearby mom-and-pop shops, starving the public schools, and tanking the city budget. Akron as a whole, deeply intertwined with whatever happened at the Goodyear campus, had to wake up to the harsh truth that the slow death of this rubber juggernaut wasn't just going to wreck their wallets, it was going to completely rewrite the town's entire culture and everyday way of life. Local communities that used to thrive on the vibrant pulse of manufacturing employees experienced a noticeable economic cooldown, and the bright hopes that originally fueled the ascent of Akron were slowly overshadowed by doubts regarding what lay ahead for the town. From a technical standpoint, the facility faced a major turning point. Specific manufacturing sectors received significant upgrades, bringing in robotic systems and cutting-edge equipment meant to boost output while cutting down on payroll expenses. However, those financial commitments were not enough to completely counter the massive financial shifts that were actively destroying classic factory work. A handful of structures inside the sprawling compound ended up being given new functions or taken apart piece by piece, whereas different sections simply turned into artifacts kept around for the moment but facing a huge threat of becoming totally useless. The sharp contrast pitting modern advancement against physical deterioration became glaringly obvious as fresh methods operated, awkwardly next to ancient gear, forming a chaotic blend of operations that perfectly reflected the shifting nature of both the specific plant and the entire manufacturing sector. The closing chapters of the Goodyear rubber facility serve as powerful proof of how complicated corporate existence gets during a downward spiral. These times expose an operation that pulled off incredible milestones in manufacturing, creativity, and community influence, but ultimately fell victim to external pressures it could not control. International trade, digital advancements, financial realignments, and shifting workforce dynamics all played a part. This specific era puts a spotlight on the personal toll triggered by a shrinking manufacturing landscape. The lingering doubts, the need to adjust, and the sheer toughness demanded when institutions that anchored families for generations suddenly transform or vanish entirely. Employees made shifts wherever they could find a way. Company leaders took on brutal decisions just to keep the doors open, while the town of Akron started to completely rethink its cultural core without the massive manufacturing powerhouse that used to be its hallmark. As this distinct period came to a close, the Goodyear Manufacturing Center had morphed from a shining beacon of endless corporate expansion into a stark warning about how nothing lasts forever. That constant, roaring buzz of creation had finally faded into silence. Massive corridors and workspaces simply held the ghosts of a forgotten time, and the unstoppable heartbeat of the assembly zone had dropped down to a weak crawl marked only by shrinking operations and survival tactics. Still, right up until the very end, the complex held onto a deep feeling of mission and historical weight. This place literally molded the futures of multiple family trees, constructed an entire municipality, pushed the boundaries of raw goods and operational techniques, and stamped a permanent legacy right onto the rubber market as well as the larger United States manufacturing scene. The story of this time frame, packed with sadness and deep thought, serves as a wake-up call that massive corporate kingdoms, regardless of their sheer power, remain completely vulnerable to the unstoppable tidal waves of financial, digital, and cultural transformations, proving that a narrative of collapse is just as essential to human advancement as any tale of growth. Chapter 8. Deserted Corridors. When the Goodyear rubber compound finally limped into its last 20 or 30 years, massive chunks of the previously booming manufacturing site had gone completely dead, turning into a confusing maze of deserted pathways, vacant conveyor belts, and stripped-down storage centers. These exact zones, which formerly pulsed with the non-stop crashing of heavy machinery, blenders, and transport tracks, presently rang out with nothing but the fading memories of hard work, clever inventions, and drive. Strolling down those lifeless hallways, a person could practically feel the heavy burden of the past, with the collective perspiration, dedication, and mastery of countless laborers permanently branded right into the brickwork. Corrosion slowly ate away at the iron support beams. Flakes of color fell from the rafters and overheads, while shattered glass let the wild weather push its way indoors, speeding up the rot and destroying the spectacular design that once stood for United States manufacturing dominance. Those empty passageways meant a lot more than just vacant square footage. They stood as powerful memorials to the relentless ticking of the clock, to the fleeting reality of the mightiest corporate dynasties, and to the backbreaking effort that initially transformed them into hubs of massive output and honor. The mind-blowing size of the facility only made the emptiness feel that much worse. Whole structures that used to be packed tight with lines of equipment and busy staff members now sat totally bare. The concrete flooring was split wide open and trashed with the leftover garbage of historical output. Thrown-out transport strips, oxidized stamping machines, wooden skids stacked with useless supplies and hardware that nobody had thought about in ages. The absolute quiet was overwhelming, interrupted merely by the random groaning of steel or the soft breeze blowing past shattered panes. Inside the zones where synthetic compounds used to be blended, the smell hung around just a little bit, acting as a haunting memory of the scientific combinations and boiling temperatures that originally gave purpose to the space. Supply closets, which were formerly kept in perfect order, currently held the scraps of ancient stock, towering piles of casting shapes and mechanical components that were absolutely never going to be used for their original job again. Each little nook and every single dark corridor told a story of a workforce that had completely disappeared, abandoning a manufacturing carcass stained by both incredible success and ultimate ruin. Those empty avenues additionally exposed the harsh aftermath of explosive corporate growth crashing right into a severe scaleback. The compound had expanded at such breakneck speeds throughout. During the company's most successful era, builders focused entirely on getting the job done quickly rather than making things last forever. Once manufacturing ground to a halt and assembly lines went quiet, upkeep fell completely behind, leaving whole sections of the building to slowly crumble away. A combination of outright abandonment, decades of aging, and brutal weather turned these areas into ghost towns with daylight piercing through caved-in ceilings to illuminate thick layers of grime over workspaces that crews used to keep spotless. Abandoned hardware gradually rusted out while the heavy rubber transport tracks completely collapsed. The very gear that pumped life into the rubber manufacturing process sat totally useless, serving merely as a dusty monument to a bygone age. Strolling down those corridors gave you a frontline view of just how vulnerable manufacturing superpowers really are, proving that even the most massive, cutting-edge facilities will quickly turn into rotting quiet tombs the second that manpower, money, and momentum disappear. The psychological and community impact of those empty corridors hit just as hard. Whenever old crew members walked through, they felt a tangled knot of deep sadness, fond memories, and dignity, because those factory floors meant grueling shifts, real craftsmanship, and personal purpose, making the sheer emptiness a painful reminder that nothing lasts forever. Entire towns that grew and thrived on the back of those factory whistle shifts were suddenly looking at complete financial devastation along with a deeply depressing daily view of their shattered livelihoods. Everything from local mom-and-pop shops to housing developments and school districts had boomed right alongside the plant's success. Ultimately, the hollowed-out facility perfectly reflected the downward spiral of the surrounding town. Akron's entire identity had been wrapped up in Goodyear and the rubber industry for generations. But the city was finally forced to watch its greatest monuments of innovation sit completely dead, rotting away in total silence. In that way, those deserted corridors meant so much more than just bricks and mortar. They stood as a shrine to the working class, a mirror of economic shifts, and a brutal wake-up call that absolutely no powerhouse is too big to fail. From an engineering standpoint, the gutted parts of the facility showcase pure outdatedness alongside the devastation with cutting-edge tread assembly tracks sitting totally paralyzed. Massive blending machines and stamping presses were surrendering to oxidation, while high-tech testing labs that once birthed fresh rubber formulas sat completely deserted. Heavy machinery was buried under thick layers of dirt, surrounded by paperwork that nobody cared about anymore. Seeing that rotting ingenuity right next to active assembly operations really threw the chaotic, unpredictable reality of factory closures into sharp relief. A few specific wings managed to evolve, get upgrades, and keep the lights on while the rest were handed over to Mother Nature. The whole scene perfectly captured the clash between brilliant human engineering and the hard truth that nothing is permanent. It became a spot where the ghosts of hard work and bright ideas hung around long after the concrete started falling apart. Pictures, aerial camera shots, and stories from people who walked the grounds during that era really highlight just how strangely gorgeous those empty ruins were. Beams of daylight would slice through broken glass to throw eerie silhouettes over the bare concrete, while steps guided you into spaces completely choked with grime and the ghosts of old shifts. Gigantic steel supports that used to shine and shake with raw power were now painted with thick orange decay and dead quiet. Looking at those spaces hit you right in the gut, stirring up this weird mix of total amazement and heavy heartbreak, driving home the point that mechanical triumphs are deeply tied to everyday people and are honestly pretty fragile in the end. Those deserted wings stand as proof of the massive dreams that got them off the ground in the first place, as well as the unstoppable march of the clock that turned them from booming hubs of invention into totally frozen graveyards. When you look at the big picture of the rubber giant and its hometown of Akron, those specific corridors are incredibly important. They map out the exact lifespan of manufacturing dynasties. Explosive growth driven by fresh ideas, long-term power, maintained by sheer blue-collar grit, slow tweaks to survive shifting consumer demands, and finally massive layoffs and boarded-up windows. These are zones where you can actually touch the past, where the crumbling walls tell a story far better than any textbook ever could. Every single empty workspace, every dead, quiet hallway, and every piece of oxidized gear serves as a stark lesson about blue-collar ambition, massive corporate wins, and the brutal reality that even the biggest factories eventually fall. Taking a stroll through that gutted tire facility forces you to look right at the incredible highs and the devastating lows of blue-collar evolution, letting you feel the lingering pulse of the sweat and muscle that built the entire town, and making you realize that a factory's impact lives on far beyond its final day of operation. Surviving through the people, the remaining brickwork, and the permanent scars it left on the American manufacturing map. Chapter 9, Tearing Down the Titan. Wrecking balls swinging at that legendary rubber plant signaled the absolute point of no return end for one of the most dominant manufacturing powerhouses in the country's history. It was a procedure marked less by flashy demolition and more by systematic elimination. Anything that couldn't be retooled, updated, or given a fresh purpose faced a slow-phase shutdown, eventually wiping out whole manufacturing areas completely. Tearing it down wasn't an overnight affair. Rather, it unfolded through a lengthy series of choices fueled by financial factors, hazard prevention, and the harsh truths of contemporary factory work. Structures previously used for blending rubber, running the vulcanizing machines, and conducting quality checks were officially deemed outdated. Crews unhooked the equipment, severed the electricity, and gutted the insides to salvage any parts that still held value. All that was left behind were bare metal skeletons, cement grounds, and quiet empty halls that simply didn't fit into the company's long-term vision. Tearing everything down physically laid bare the sheer magnitude of construction that had taken place over 100-plus years, featuring endless stretches of pipes, giant structural pillars, heavy-duty flooring built to handle intense shaking and high temperatures, and architecture specifically designed to keep things running 24/7. Taking all of this apart went far beyond just wrecking things. It turned into a highly complicated coordination effort that highlighted just how intertwined the facility was with the town's landscape and financial heartbeat. Once the wrecking teams arrived on site, the entire look and feel of the facility shifted in a major way. Spaces previously packed with heavy equipment transformed into gaping holes, bare girders, and crumbling brickwork. Workers torched the metal and trucked it off while masonry fronts caved in and ceilings were ripped open, leaving hollowed-out rooms completely exposed to the elements. Clouds of debris took the place of factory exhaust, and absolute quiet took over where rhythmic machinery once hummed. Taking down each building meant more than just a drop in output. It signaled the end of a manufacturing era. The teardown was highly calculated and intentional, strictly following hazard rules and ecological protocols. Even so, you couldn't ignore the heavy emotional toll that came with seeing those iconic structures fall to the ground. For tens of years, these sites had essentially shaped the local skyline and given the city its core character, acting as massive monuments to financial power and blue-collar pride. Knocking them down proved that the golden age they stood for wasn't just fading away, it was gone for good. Ripping the facility apart also laid bare the complex multi-generational past hidden within the site. The aging wings put up during the initial 20th century boom were put together quite differently than the newer annexes, showing how manufacturing codes and goals shifted over time. Dense masonry and massive wooden beams from the early days clashed against the metal frame designs brought in during the mid-1900s upgrades. With each structural layer stripped back, the factory showcased its own timeline of progress. Every new wave of building was a direct answer to booming demand, fierce market rivalry, and massive leaps in tech. More often than not, the most ancient structures were the first ones to bite the dust, since they just couldn't measure up to today's strict productivity or hazard standards. Wiping them off the map wasn't some random fluke. It was bound to happen sooner or later. It came from decades of slow, steady changes that chipped away at the need for massive single-hub rubber manufacturing right there in town. For the local community, tearing down the complex marked a massive shift, not just on the map, but in their collective mindset. This place had always been way more than just somewhere to punch a clock. It was a looming giant that dictated housing trends, job markets, and everyday routines. Seeing it all get ripped down made everyone face the hard truth: the city's blue-collar soul had permanently shifted gears. Even though the parent company kept on running and doing business in other places, the actual brick-and-mortar roots of its legacy were vanishing chunk by chunk. The whole tear-down routine turned highly recognizable, hometown spots into vacant dirt patches and chain-link compounds, completely rewiring the city layout and forcing locals to brainstorm fresh ideas for acres that used to be all about mass production. Going through this change was far from a neat or easy ride, yet it mirrored the massive cultural waves hitting similar factory towns all over the Rust Belt, where wrecking crews usually took over the assembly lines to close out a financial generation. On a practical level, bringing the site down meant dealing with tens of years of stacked-up structural baggage, such as ancient power grids, toxic leftover spills, and degrading building supplies. Zones previously used to mix synthetic blends, heavy lubricants, and harsh commercial solvents required incredibly cautious cleanup procedures, hammering home the point that the true footprint of heavy manufacturing went way deeper than just the buildings you could see. Hauling off the old machines and tearing down the walls was equally focused on cleaning up historical messes as it was on prepping the dirt for tomorrow. Every flattened warehouse stood for thousands of man-hours poured in over the years, all boiled down to scrap metal and bare earth. The whole operation felt muted and deeply bureaucratic, yet incredibly persistent, proving that manufacturing death spirals rarely happen in one explosive moment, but rather through quiet boardroom choices and a slow, agonizing pullout. Once the wrecking crews finally wrapped up, whatever was left of the old rubber hub looked absolutely nothing like the massive fortress that used to rule the city. Vast stretches of land lay completely barren, broken up merely by shattered concrete bases and a few lonely buildings standing by for the wrecking ball. The sheer emptiness felt profound. Places that previously hummed with the endless grind of machinery and the sweat of countless laborers were replaced by quiet, wide-open skies and ghost-like footprints of the past. Taking down this behemoth wasn't about erasing history. Rather, it was a hard truth that the brick-and-mortar symbol of Goodyear's manufacturing reign had simply run its course. The teardown signaled a massive shift away from a blue-collar heritage diving headfirst into an unpredictable era, driven by fresh financial realities, shifting goals, and a brand-new take on what progress actually means. During its closing chapter, the facility wasn't left to rot and crumble. Instead, crews methodically picked the massive complex apart, carving out a cleared terrain that served as a silent, striking testament to human drive elbow grease and the harsh reality that even the mightiest corporate titans eventually face their twilight. Chapter 10. The Spirit Remains. Leveling the actual physical facility didn't write the final page of the company's saga, but it certainly flipped the script on how that legacy fit into today's United States. Even as the machinery in Akron finally quieted down, the gritty heritage built on those production lines kept influencing the brands, steering the local community, and defining the overarching tale of the country's manufacturing muscle. The corporation certainly didn't turn to dust alongside its flagship facility. Instead, leadership pivoted, packed up and reorganized, trading their heavy reliance on localized, large-scale assembly lines for a future deeply rooted in cutting-edge development, engineering breakthroughs, and a worldwide supply chain. State-of-the-art home offices, high-tech testing grounds, and modern think tanks sprang up, showcasing a fresh spin on that exact same relentless drive that originally got the massive Ohio compound off the ground. The enduring heritage wasn't tallied up by towering chimneys or conveyor belts anymore. It was now calculated through intellectual property, technical brilliance, and an international presence stretching way past the Buckeye State. Even so, evolving like this carried a heavy, unavoidable price tag, tearing the brand's very soul away from its hometown roots. When it came to the folks in Akron, the aftermath hit much closer to home and carried a lot more baggage. A town historically recognized across the globe as the undisputed center of rubber production suddenly had to figure out who it was without the very business that put it on the map. Echoes of the massive complex were permanently baked into local road designs housing tracks and entire family trees whose daily routines had completely depended on factory whistles and quota demands for decades. The physical structures vanished, but the deep-seated local culture wouldn't budge. Blue-collar know-how handed from parent to child, legendary tales of grueling hours and personal compromises, along with a community-wide respect for the sheer grit required by factory life, kept molding the region's tough, resilient vibe. The true ghost of the facility didn't survive in rusted gears behind museum glass. It survived in the very DNA of Akron's people. It serves as a stark wake-up call that massive corporate enterprises scar a region far more profoundly than mere brick and mortar ever could. Zooming out to look at the whole country, the rise and fall of this Ohio powerhouse perfectly mirrored a much broader stateside trend. It perfectly captured the era when heavy industry drove the explosive wealth of the 20th century, showcased the absolute zenith of factory-driven supremacy, and highlighted the slow grinding transition into a completely new financial landscape. What the compound left behind painted a vivid picture of ingenuity, forging massive monopolies, while simultaneously proving just how easily those titans could bleed when faced with overseas rivals. Rapid digital advancements in changing consumer values. The fact that the brand kept its head above water proved they knew how to pivot and roll with the punches. However, watching their flagship hometown hub go under threw a massive spotlight on the painful tug-of-war between modern advancement and wiping out working-class livelihoods. Because of this, what remains isn't just a happy victory lap. It's a harsh masterclass serving up brutal truths regarding unchecked expansion, corporate monopolies, and the heavy lingering fallout of boardroom choices. Yet the personal human element of this entire saga is probably what will stick around the longest. Countless thousands of everyday folks clocked into the Ohio facility during its prime, pouring in their sweat while bringing a deep sense of character, relentless work ethic, and fierce hometown honor to the floor. That daily grind was the very fuel that skyrocketed the brand's global reach, put food on local tables, and quite literally constructed the surrounding neighborhoods from scratch. Long after the final whistle blew and the wrecking crews packed up, the impact of that immense labor force refused to fade into the background. You can still find it echoing through pension hall chatter, buried in old union documents woven into local genealogies, and kept alive by the collective nostalgia of what it actually felt like to bleed for one of the nation's most formidable manufacturing juggernauts. The history lives on through a sobering realization today's incredible economic comforts were forged entirely on the sore shoulders of everyday employees. Folks who will likely never get a mention in polished shareholder reports, but whose calloused hands were the absolute bedrock of that corporate triumph. From a purely physical and metaphorical standpoint, the gaping hole left by the demolished facility morphed into a profound part of its own ongoing mythos. The vacant lots and newly flipped real estate projects didn't scream that history was wiped clean. Rather, they broadcast a loud message of radical evolution. In spots where heavy manufacturing used to be the undisputed king, fresh ventures steadily took root, perfectly mirroring modern priorities and the harsh truths of a modern economy. Wiping the colossal structure off the map ultimately pushed the community into a tough conversation about which pieces of history were worth saving, which spots needed a fresh coat of paint and a new dot, and which memories were best left to peacefully drift away. Because of this, the lasting footprint of the Akron facility went far deeper than mere sentimental longing, forcing municipalities and governing bodies to face the enduring fallout of heavy manufacturing booms, followed by inevitable downturns. The situation raised tough ethical debates regarding environmental viability, corporate duty, and the crucial bond linking big business with local towns. At the end of the day, the historical imprint of that massive rubber operation survives not as some static historical marker, but rather as a complex saga of sheer drive, blue-collar sweat, massive triumphs, and bitter defeats. There are no easy takeaways from this tale. The company itself survived, yet the specific era that birthed its flagship hub faded away forever. Watching the facility grow highlighted what human ingenuity and massive manufacturing could achieve. Conversely, its ultimate collapse exposed the harsh boundaries of those same powers within a rapidly shifting international market. All that is left behind are echoes of the past lingering cultural impacts and a profound warning sign for how we view manufacturing today. The true heritage we take away is the harsh reality that forward momentum is never guaranteed to last. It proves that massive corporate empires are forged by local workers and their hometowns just as heavily as any machine, while each passing age leaves a trail of both great miracles and empty voids. Across the silent grounds that previously housed the colossal Akron complex, the genuine spirit of the brand persists, found not within standing brick or steel, but rather through the lessons we retain, the history we honor, and the wisdom we take with us into tomorrow.